Call to order a special meeting for City of Waverly, November 16th. We have an agenda in front of us. Any motion on the agenda?
Move approval.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Agenda is approved. Our agenda is discussion of the fiscal year 2018-19 budget, planning purposes. So I will turn it over to City Administrator James Bronner, and away you go.
Okay. Our goal tonight is to give kind of a brief overview of a little bit of what we're facing going into the budget next year. Talk about some of the departmental projects we have going. There's not that many, which is, so it'll be somewhat brief. We have a few that we're going to discuss. And then we'll get into probably some of the infrastructure projects, most of which we've discussed at length already. But it'll just be to kind of bring us back up to speed on all of them, kind of get an indication of where you think these should go, kind of some possible funding issues, and just a little bit of everything. So that being the case, I know every year we get into comparisons, and somehow we really like to compare to other cities, and I've never really been a big fan of that. But to humor everyone who likes to do that, we pulled some numbers and some figures. The cities I like to focus on are the cities that are between 5,000 and 15,000 in population. You know, we're at about 10,000 roughly, so that gives us kind of an even distribution somewhat on each side. And so in looking at that, there's 56 cities in the state that are between 5,000 and 15,000. Clive on the higher end, and this is all 2010 census. Clive is obviously way past 15,000 now. They're probably in the 20s. And then on the 5,000 range down to Harlan. But it's a good cross-section across the state. The college towns, county seats, similar in size, a little bigger, a little smaller. And when you look at those, and this is all off the Department of Management website, that's where I'm getting my information from. Anybody go out and look at it. It's all out there for the public. We are 15th in population out of this group, 15th largest. Our valuation is the 13th largest. Our debt levy is the 16th largest, so we're all in that fact. Our
James.
employee benefit levy is 38th,
James, how many cities are we talking?
56.
56.
And our total tax rate is 35th out of 56. And
You say 35th.
35th. We're the 35th highest. So there are 21 lower than us. We're 35th. And again, I guess when I look at that, I don't care. It's great to compare that, but I don't honestly care what's happening in these other cities. They're not us. They don't have our topography. They don't have our demographic. They don't have our workforce. They don't have our industry. So to put a lot of time comparing, I don't think is worth much for us to do that. Again, some people really like to do that. I don't particularly want to. I want you as a council to determine what is the best for this city, what do you think is reasonable, and we'll go that route. What I will tell you is our tax rate right now is at 14.17928. That was an increase of about 15 cents from last year. When we set this, we had some capital outlay for property for Champions Ridge. We had a number of other things throughout the budget. In the end, we were about 15 cents higher. Of that, $8.10, of course, the 810 levy is there. We have about 35 cents in smaller items from our property and liability insurance, about $3 in benefits, employee insurance, et cetera, and then our debt levy is at $2.73. So that's what makes up our 14.17928. So again, we can talk about other cities. I would prefer not to waste our time because I don't know if they're building infrastructure. I don't know if they're growing. I don't know if they're shrinking. I don't honestly care if they are. No offense to them, but I'd rather worry about what we are doing as Waverly, and I'd rather have them compare to us, what we've done, not what our number is. So that's why I'd rather focus going forward in this budget. That being said, we do have some challenges next year, as everybody in the state will. IPERS did increase this year, so we will be paying more towards the employee-funded retirement pension. And 411 went up as well on the police side. So again, things we can't control, we will just have to adjust to those. At some point, work with Jennifer, and we'll kind of get an indication of what that dollar amount looks like. But right now, we recently received that information that it has jumped up. The rollbacks came out, and so residential dropped, which means that on the similar valuation, we'll be collecting less taxes based on the same household. That's not favorable as a city for us as well. Multi-residential dropped again, as is the plan. So even if we have decent growth, some of that will be offset by the reduction in values that the state has imposed on the multi-residential, and then, of course, the residential itself. Agriculture increased significantly, but we don't have a lot of agriculture ground inside the city limits. So the county should be helped by that a little bit, but it's not going to do us much good. And so those are some of the items that we'll be kind of working through, trying to get some dollar amounts on to see what we're going to have an impact on. But there's not much we can do about it. We just have to adjust and try and figure out how to, factor that in.
We have no idea on backfill.
No, the commercial side of that, the backfill, it was capped in fiscal 17. And so if there is an abundance above and beyond that, that will not be backfilled. So in theory, while they're still providing it, you're still losing it. Because if we're one of them that had a substantial increase in commercial property, let's say, above and beyond what we had prior, we will not receive that amount, is what I'm understanding. So I don't know if it was a statewide cap or if it was an individual municipality cap, and that's something we're trying to figure out. But regardless, as commercial property increases across the state, the backfill stays the same, and that additional amount is not filled. So while you'll hear that we're still providing it, well, you kind of are, but you really aren't, because it's still dropping. It's not 100% funded like it had been up till fiscal 17, they capped it. So as far as if it's going to go away or not, there is always that speculation. There's a lot of people saying that it probably will, as you've seen reports from the state and some of the funding issues they're having and the fund balance issues they have and the revenue issues they have. They'll be looking for ways to prop themselves up. That's a very attractive one, looking at the the backfill, because it's not their money. It's our money, schools and county. And so we'll see. That's the best I can tell you. I hope that it still continues on. If they are going to eliminate it, I hope it's gradual, so we can try to absorb some of that hit. But past history has shown when it goes, and we don't get a lot of notice. It just kind of happens. So hopefully that won't be the case. But we'll know more of that probably. Well, actually, we may not know until we're done with our budget, depending on how quickly they move through theirs at the state level. So.
So we probably really shouldn't count on it in any kind of planning or budgeting.
Right. We'll try and factor in a percentage or kind of look at what the worst case scenario could be, and we'll try and have that all factored out by January when we really dig into this, because I do think eventually it is going to go away.
Yeah,
I just think it is.
recall reading some stories over the past month or two about not being really committed to it from the state level, continuing it, so.
Yeah, as the people that passed it move on or move out, the people that come in seem to not remember that was promised to us. So we'll work and adjust to it best we can. So with that, we'll kind of start to get in a little more of the departmental budgets. And again, there's not a whole lot that we're going to probably bring up, because luckily we don't have a lot of substantial items in each of the smaller departmental budgets to work from. I did have an email discussion with Fire Chief Happel today. He could not attend tonight. He was planning to, but he's out of town. They are looking at a pumper truck, I believe, replacement next year. I think it's shared half and half with rural fire. And so it'll probably be, his estimate was about $250,000 a piece for that truck. So that's one of the larger pieces of equipment we'll be looking at next year from the fire department. We did not have any other items listed from them. And then I know we have a couple individuals with EMS, the hospital here, and if they want to just pop up for just a minute and kind of explain some of what they're looking at, that would be outstanding.
Sure. One of our ambulances is due to be repurposed, replaced this year. We had purchased it in 2009. It currently has 222,000 miles on it. And every year, it looks like the city has put money away to repurchase another ambulance. So for fiscal year 2019, there is 200,000 in the bank to pay for the replacement ambulance.
We're hoping with trade-in that'll be adequate. The last one was within that, And so that's kind of our goal, is to see, how many are we running total now? Are we still running
3
three?
ambulances.
Okay. I know we have another one that's almost as old as this one, though, so.
Yep, they're set on every 3-year recycling out and being replaced.
Okay.
What
So
do
we'll have to look at that as well in the next year or two, the other one, and how it's going to maintain and be held up.
What do we typically get on a trade-in?
10,000. Yep, and it looks like we budget away about 66,000 a year, or that's been the last 2019 year.
So that is our hope, that we can get one purchased and within the budget we have. That's why we've allocated, as we have the funding year after year, to continue that rotation. And I know that's been a lot of topic in the past, and even the media currently, about the issues of the EMS and how to provide it in the rural areas. And of course, Waverly's, the largest in this community and the county, and does respond clear across this county and even into Butler. And,
Correct, Butler County.
so it is quite a demand. It's not just city limits. Obviously, these ambulances are everywhere. And so hopefully we'll be able to continue with the other one and keep it going, because I know it's about the same age.
Correct, yep.
So we have issues with that too. When was the other one purchased?
That would have been
No, I can't remember.
2012 then,
Okay.
3 years.
So,
And it's,
And you're saying that that's a 50/50 split between the city and the county?
no, that's us.
That's all us?
That's us. Yep. We provide the equipment for the ambulance service.
Okay.
The
We just
fire
are out
truck
in the
is-
county a lot. That's why we use local option sales tax to pay for that piece of it, because it goes everywhere within the area, not just in the city limits of Waverly.
Kind of a side note, the fire truck, we also have been setting money aside and looking at the budget. It looks like we're about 100,000 there also.
I believe so. I think that's correct. And, I
Close to
didn't,
half of that would be already in reserves.
and I didn't have a chance to talk to Dennis about, is it other funding sources he's gonna try to utilize, or is that sole source? But he's saying about 250,000 would be our share of what he thought that would be. And you kind of got to have that. You certainly want to bumper truck around, so we'll try and factor that in as well. I don't know if anybody has any other questions for Robin here with the ambulance EMS?
all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Robin. So the other item that we'll probably jump into, though, will probably be with leisure services. I know Tab has a couple things. We're going to kind of walk through some sizable items. One of them Monday we'll have a little more discussion on as well, but I'll let Tab kind of walk us through a couple significant things we're looking at for next year also.
Good evening. Couple projects we're looking at in the near future is, number one, South Riverside Park renovation. Like James said, that we're going to get the formal presentation of that on Monday night. And the way we've got that set up is it could be phased in several different ways. So depending on if the project is approved, it could be at different levels over a couple of years. Secondly, we are looking at doing, we have done an RFP and sent them out to consultants to look at replacement of the turf care center. Several years ago, the health center purchased half of the block that the turf care center's on and turned it into a parking lot. This is the block on 8th Street between 4th and 5th Avenue Southwest. And they are interested in pursuing, we haven't got a date or a specific request yet, in pursuing the rest of that block. And the rest of the block has the turf care center in it that houses all the golf course operations. So what we're doing is we're sending an RFP out for a consultant to come in and do a feasibility study of the existing buildings on the fairgrounds to see if any of them could be converted, or if they don't think it's feasible, to build a new turf care center on the fairgrounds property, because that's our property. And there's a few factors that will affect that. Will the fair be gone? Those types of things. So we're just trying to get ready for when the call comes, and because they're already asking for temporary parking over the winter in our turf care center area. Lastly, I think you've seen this graph before. This is a graph of the area maintained by Leisure Services starting in 1985 up to present. And we basically almost doubled in acres, and we've practically doubled in buildings and over doubled in buildings and we didn't have any trail back in 85. Now we have 14 miles of trail. So what we're looking at doing is establishing a vegetation management division, and that would involve maintenance of the non-maintained areas. So that would be trails, detention basins, medians, prairies, trees, those types of things, and pull that out of public services and out of leisure services or parks, and so they can do the things that they're supposed to be doing better. It would involve some transfer of hours, seasonal hours from both parks and cemetery. It would involve a transfer of staff from public services and one new staff person. So we'll be happy to go into detail on that, but that will affect our operations. Otherwise, our operations are pretty well normal. Okay.
Any questions for Tab on those couple items? And obviously, when we get to January, we'll go in much deeper depth on all departmental budgets, but we're wanting to highlight the significant pieces that'll be a little more impactful to the budget as we go forward.
I think it's a great move to start the new vegetation division. I know we've worked on a couple of catch basins, water basins that have been neglected in this last year and kind of got them back up. So putting a little more focus on there is certainly needed.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. As I said, we don't really have a lot of other significant items in the rest of the departmental budgets. I don't know, department head, if there's anybody else that wants to talk about any issue, they certainly can. If not, obviously a core piece of each of those departments is personnel, and then you get the benefits, we're talking about APRS, et cetera, and then the operational piece has been fairly flat off and on throughout the years. The biggest driver is usually capital. And again, we'll get into that again this year with equipment replacement and things of that nature. So we'll have a list of that for you eventually to look into, and we'll kind of process through that, same as we have in the past, trying to figure out, do we or do we not need that equipment, et cetera. And so
Major, I'm just thinking any major equipment purchases, particularly like the police. Are we looking at any vehicles with that, or are we just still setting aside for future?
we're ready to purchase. So if you want to add to that, Rich, please.
Yeah, this will be the rotation for fleet replacement for the three, and just like we had done before, we budget a third, and then we'll rotate out. So we do have 2/3 put away at this point.
Okay, that was just one in my mind
Yep.
that was coming. That's a regular, bigger purchase of.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One kind of global question I have before we maybe move on. Through the rollback and multifamily, those type of things, we'll probably see a little bit of dip in our total of evaluation. With the dry run, we expect to see those properties increase in valuation.
It's
And when would that
possible
come
eventually when the, if they're taken out of the floodplain, which I think is it this fall, Mike, that should happen
December.
with FEMA? Still, it would be, is it December this?
December.
How long do you anticipate it takes to see those properties increase?
Well, evaluations will occur January 1, and that would be for the fiscal year after. So you'd be talking fiscal 20 or beyond that could occur.
I think what you're going to see, Dan, is people aren't going to see a 10, 20% increase. It's not going to be like overnight that's going to happen. What we anticipate happening is over the next decade that because flood insurance will not be a requirement of a mortgage, that it means that gradually over time that we're going to see market value of these properties increase. We're going to see people reinvest into their homes and maintain them. And that over a period of time that there may be some change, but I think we want to be very, very careful that simply because there's a remapping doesn't mean that the assessor's going to turn around tomorrow and do a significant change. It has to be based off of market sales.
My assumption was it would be more organic as properties turnover and that type of thing. I just had a few people ask me, will they come out and do the reassessment right away, that type of thing.
And that's the hard thing with the valuation too. I mean, we'll have growth, I think, as we always have, but then how much of it is netted out from the drop in valuation, as you said, from multi-residential to residential. And that, again, that all plays into the tax rate and the valuation. And so, again, that's why we don't like to just focus on a single number, as some people want to just focus on. It's too complicated for that. It all works together, and you have a lower rate because you have higher valuations. And we don't like the higher valuations because then we're taxed more, but then it helps the rate to lower so you're taxed less. It's where does it net out in the end? And that's what we're going to focus on this year, is what is the total net when this is all said and done. So yeah, I'm hopeful for a good increase in growth because of the new structures that have come online, that true growth, not just the artificial on paper growth that everything's worth a little more, or an equalization order, which thankfully we don't have that this year either, which kind of causes a little chaos as well from the state. So we're hopeful that we'll have a good housing spurt continuing and we'll have some valuation growth, but again, we'll have to see how much is offset by the change in rollback in the multi-residential drop. And multi-residential is going to continue to drop about 4% a year for the next number of years, and then eventually it'll be close to where your residential rate will be. And there was always that talk of residential rate rising. This year it dipped, so we're not sure what's happening with that. But yeah, it all factors into it. And so the biggest piece that we kind of talked about, and I've always kind of alluded to that, I think a lot of our budget change or our budget issue is going to be infrastructure this year. We focus a lot on our projects, and we should, because we have a lot of projects in the hopper right now that are going. We'll kind of talk through the first half dozen of them or so that, when staff and I met weeks ago, we looked at where do we think our individual budgets are going to go, what do we think for a project standpoint, the ones that we probably really need to do, even above and beyond the ones that have been discussed with council. And then there's, of course, a list of projects we'd like to do going forward, and we'll kind of touch on some of those as well. And what I kind of like to get a little sense of is your thoughts on these projects and the priority of them. Obviously, we're not going to vote on anything. We can't do that tonight. But just to give an indication of, as we move closer to our budget coming online, the scenarios of what we should fund, what we should not fund. We worked through a lot of them, and it's possible in certain combinations, but not everything can be done at once. And I think everybody's probably well aware of that. We do have a capacity that we have to stay within. And what I mean by capacity is, the new council here, we have a legal limitation set by the state. Everybody does, whether it's county, city, schools. You can only borrow up to 5% of your total valuation, your taxable valuation. And so the total valuation for the city of Waverly is around, I believe it's around 800 million. So if all the property within the city limits was valued, it's about 800 million. And so 5% of that, quick number to be about 40 million. We're a little less than that. We're in the upper 30s. That's how much we can borrow at any one time. 38, 40 million total on the books, period. And we are probably in the mid to high 20s right now. So we do have a self-imposed 80% cap that we will not go across as well on that value. And for some perspective, my prior credit Blackhawk County, that limit was 440 million. It's a little different animal when you come here because the bridge costs the same, the road costs the same, but you have a lot more room to just borrow if you want, versus here, we're very limited in what we can do. So when we get into the Parkway at 9 or 10 million, that's significant, and that's not something we just can easily do. If you get into a $5 million bridge, that's not something we can easily do. We have to work through what's falling off from a debt payments and what we do and don't have and the availability. And that's where we kind of stagger out these projects year after year to see if they'll all fit, and we have to be mindful of where our percentage use is, and because the bonding agencies look at that and they kind of want to see a plan to reduce it. I will tell you that everything we're looking at going forward is a 10-year bond or less. So we are not extending out. And that's kind of a double-edged sword too. If you do a 15-year bond, it's a little less on the taxes. but it doesn't open up any capacity. Whereas a 10-year bond pays off faster, so you open up more capacity, but it's a little more on the taxes. So that's where the balance comes in, and what you have to figure out and look at is where is that gray area that you're comfortable with. And that's what we'll try and help you through this year as we look at all these projects. So let's talk through a handful of them. If you have any questions or anything, please stop, please ask, and we'll kind of talk through what we can here. The first one, obviously, is Bremer Avenue. As you can see, it's progressing nicely, and we're hoping in the next month it's wrapped up for the year. Hopefully sooner than that, but it looks like they're doing very well pouring. We're getting that done. We will pay a portion of that. DOT is picking up the bulk of it. Anywhere from 4.5, 5 million, depending on when the final bill comes in. And so once the project is done, they will bill us 3 payments over 3 years, and that is the piece we'll have to cover. I've talked to Mike a bit, and I think the first payment we're hoping would be a payment for the water main. Because if you can do a revenue bond for water, it does not account against your capacity. So again, that helps us in that route. And then the next 2 payments would be for the rest of the construction that would go through. So it could be probably about $1.6 million, let's say, each year for those 3 years. And that's what we've kind of tried to factor in, and we're doing some of this planning. And again, we really don't have a choice in that one. It's there, we're gonna have to pay our share back to DOT. So that's one we've kind of locked in, is we need to just continue on and finish that. We've had a lot of discussion on 20th Street. And I know when the cost estimates came in, Mike did a great job of kind of looking back as to how could we possibly afford it in the budget. And by identifying the railroad crossing, because of the federal funding we already have for that and the safety issues at hand, being able to possibly do that, and then the roadway the next year, that does help give you some options as we move forward and what the potential funding could be. Each of those options is about $1.5 million, $1.6 million, about $3.2 million total is what we're looking at. Again, we have federal funds already acquired, already designated for the bars and the signs, the crossing itself. And then the remainder would be, of course, from our debt if we go that route to finish it. But we're looking at that next year if council approves. I know Monday there'll be an item on to look at doing the professional services agreement for the engineering to get started on this if you want to move that forward. And that is that just for the railroad, Mike, that agreement, or is that for the whole thing?
So on Monday, it would be looking for, council direction to have a professional services agreement put together. I think at this point, the staff recommendation is to scale it back to the railroad crossing improvements that were previously discussed. If the council concurs, then the intent would be on December 4th to present that professional services agreement for council consideration and approval.
So if that goes through, then we'd be looking at the highway portion of that stretch the year after.
So we're not talking about extending it tonight?
No.
Yeah, well,
Well,
yeah.
go ahead, Mike.
It's close enough. It's close enough that we'd want to take a look at that, so.
So the professional services agreement would cover that, at least.
Right.
What the extra would be to do to that.
Which is only, I think it's only like 150 feet, so, yeah.
I'd like to see that on there just to see what the cost would be.
And we'll have a discussion Monday, and you can decide even at that point, the formal vote, what you'd like that professional service agreement to encompass. So I know initially it was going to be the entire project, but again, when you start looking at the depth of what that is and the area and the railroad, and since it's far enough, you have to consider it 2 crossings now. It all factored into where it's a little more than we thought it was going to be. But again, I appreciate Mike going in and finding a way to carve that off so we can still maybe get a piece of it done. Again, it's whatever council directs us to do, but that's another project we felt because of the safety issue and the federal funding, it's already allocated somewhat. We should probably look at that as well.
And that in the second year, the proposal is to improve the road to Eisenach Village and perhaps not much further than that.
Yes, sir. That would be the first phase being completed, the highway portion of it.
I think it goes a little bit beyond that, doesn't it, as I recall?
Well, and that's what we'd have to, take a look at reviewing our future projects. And would it be in 2019 or later. I mean, that has to be factored in with, a dozen or more other projects that are going to be competing for funds.
Right.
And that's why eventually we'll get into a much more in-depth planning of all those projects they sit. And while we have ideas of how they can blend in and how they fit, so to speak, it will truly be up to where council wants to place them. If you see it as a higher priority, we'll work to see how it'll blend in. Can we get it funded or not? And until we have the valuations at the end of December, early January, we really don't know exactly what we can fund. All the estimates we've used have been very, very conservative, 1% increase in value each year going out. And the trickiest part of this is it may look great in the first year or two, but you may far exceed because of other projects coming online, year 3, 4, 5. And the balance is to try and get everything to stay within the thresholds we've identified. And that's where it really has become a challenge. As we've pushed projects off or moved projects forward, all that reshifts everything. And that's kind of what we're working through. So one of the smaller projects that we have, and it's local option funded, is the Adams Parkway Bridge. We've kind of mentioned that briefly, but it's been a little while. There's some reconstruction, some repair that needs to be done on that. From a time frame, it's sensitive to Cedar Lane, is it not? As well as Bremer Avenue. Those two have been kind of looked at together, but you can't really do them
Right,
at the
and
same time.
and this is bridge deck repair work. If you've been across it, especially the northbound lane, we're seeing, southbound lane, deterioration in the bridge deck. And so it'll be 50 years old next year, and it's time to do a repair and bridge deck overlay on it. So we have to wait until the Bremer Avenue work is done, and so we'd be looking at probably a spring 2019 project.
That's what I was going to ask, is this a half a year type project where we could do spring and then Cedar Lane, or at least a portion of Cedar Lane, maybe then
Yes.
half?
Right.
Both are kind of contingent upon Bremer Avenue when it finishes, when it doesn't, because again, it's going to be a artery to get around, and that was the next one we jump into is Cedar Lane, which of course has been designed, it's been engineered. We delayed it last year, and we still have it out there as a project that we think needs to be completed eventually. Some of the discussion on that, when we look back, goes to the late 90s, being a necessity then and a need to be looked at and redone. And there has been some improvement made, whether it be some shoulder work, et cetera, but you should just go drive it as well. It's a little tough right now.
Is that something we could do engineering on both and figure out if one is going to be a little less than the other, maybe if we fit it in better for that spring of 19?
It's been engineered, Cedar Lane, I think it's ready to go.
Okay.
We just did not take it to bid, but I think, is that not correct, Mike? The engineering is completed for that project.
For the Phase 1 project, and if you're,
But for the Parkway Bridge, for Adams Parkway Bridge?
we have not done the engineering yet.
So that's one that if we got that, we could compare potentially to do one project. What I'm saying is if we're trying to fit budget-wise in there, if there's one of them that's a little cheaper that we can do in spring of 19 for the 18-19 budget, and the other one goes on to the fall for the 19-20 budget.
Well, the estimate for Cedar Lane is about $900,000. That's about what it was a year ago, whereas the Adams Parkway is about $345,000. And that's already funded through local option. We already have it planned in and funded and sitting. It's
Okay.
just a matter of accomplishing it. And so Cedar Lane is the one that's not
Significant difference.
funded yet, but yeah, it's significant. That'll take it to, is it, like Brown Lane is where it would stop then.
Correct.
So again, just a project that we delayed, we wanted to at least reintroduce because it is engineered and it's just waiting, and to at least put that out there. The big one, we'll start in on is Cedar River Parkway. We have an estimate of about $10.7 million for that. $1.2 million we've already funded in design, engineering, property acquisition, which we're working through right now, and it's going very well. So that could start in the spring, moving dirt at that point in time if council decides to go that direction. And we are moving forward as if council wants to do that until you tell us to stop. So this one is moving along. I do think it's possible. After we look through the numbers, we can fund it all in a year. It's a bit, about $9 million, maybe a little more of it, but I think we can do it in a single year. The complication, again, I won't get too far into this, we talked about it last time as well, is when you try to split it over 2 fiscal years, because June 30th is when our fiscal ends, construction doesn't stop on June 30th. It still continues. We have to just look at it differently from a new fiscal year and different funding, et cetera. If the project continues and goes through, and say it is $9 million and we spend all $9 million when it's done, we could be finished in late summer, early fall. So the bulk of that could be done that quick. We may not have enough time to get the second level of funding in place before we would have exceeded our limits and gone over our legal liability in that category that we budget, and it creates a lot of problems. So the way to avoid that is to get enough funding for it to be done in a single season, carried over into the next year if you have to. And that's about the only way we can probably do it, unless we literally stop production when we hit that dollar amount and then waiting for the next year till July 1. That's not real efficient. I think that would affect our bidding quite a bit if that's a possibility of having to do that. Unless you did it significantly, like the road at one point and the bridge separately, and I don't know how that bidding would work or play into it as well. So we tried to look at different scenarios, but I think it is possible to do it all at once. And it still leaves enough room in our capacity to do the railroad crossing and potentially even Cedar Lane as well. On paper, it works. We'll know when the valuations come in. Again, we were very conservative in what those look like. It's going to come down to capacity, I think, is there. It'll come down to what does it look like on the taxes. And that's what we'll have to figure out. Because right now, the Parkway would not impact property taxes as we have it planned out. We would use local option sales tax, which was one of the large pieces we talked about when it was renewed for 20 years. And then we would look at TIF funding to cover the other piece of that. So when the bonds are paid back, that's how we would do it instead of using property taxes. That is the initial goal. So really, you'd be looking at funding the railroad crossing portion and Cedar Lane through property taxes, through debt, as I don't know if there's other avenues yet to fund those. And that's, again, it's a little more we're going to get into tonight, but that's kind of how we're sitting right now as we're prepping to go into budget is I do believe that will work. Those seem to fit okay. It just is dependent on other factors, and we've already put in the payments for Bremer Avenue, one after the other. Those are kind of set. We can't really get away from that. We know we're going to have to pay that, and we've tried to factor in everything else that we can. So that's kind of what we have with the Parkway at hand.
Just for clarity,
Yes, sir.
you're saying the funding can be handled in 1 year, but the actual construction would be at least 2 construction seasons?
It would be over 2 fiscal years and 2 construction seasons, yes. It would go from this spring through 2018 and probably be done probably late summer 19. Is that fair?
Yeah, we're looking at a construction window of April of 18 through like September of 19.
And funding, borrowing that all up front and basically banking it doesn't cause any issues for us?
No, sir. When you look at the bond attorneys, they'll tell you that when we borrow money, you have a certain amount of time to spend 30%, and then it's 50%, and things that you have to follow, so we have to be mindful of that. But you have 18 months to 2 years for construction to spend that funding. And so if we were able to get it next July, let's say, we would have 18 months from that time period to spend it, and we would be finished in 15 or less. And so we would have enough money.
15% interest to invest it in, and
I don't think it's that much interest. I hope it's not that much interest. But that's the whole discussion of it. And of course, we would confirm to bond attorneys long before we got to this point. But right now, it was just difficult enough to get it to work on paper. And then with the other projects, because for a while it looked like if that was the case, that was going to be all we were going to do. And again, it's going to be contingent on our bidding too. If it comes in a bit higher than we think it will, we may have to readjust, and we can certainly do that. At that point in time, we're looking at, I believe, February. Is it February for the bids to come in on that, Mike?
Yeah, it's February.
So we'll know within the window of when we're doing the budget, it's going to be all hitting right then as to how that's going to look.
So just to clarify that 10.7 million will cover the road work, the bridge, and land acquisition as needed, everything, that's the package.
Yep, that's the estimate we have. And 1.2 of that has already been bonded for and is in process, so we're looking at 9 to 9.5 million more for the construction piece of it.
I guess that's one of the other underlying concerns I have is the timing to keep moving ahead and actually have it out for bids and then get through the budgeting process to figure out we want to delay it a year or two. And again,
Yeah,
just that whole mentality of getting bids and then rejecting them just because we don't want to move forward, that type of thing.
that's a tough one. This would be a hard one to reject too if we get to that point. I guess based on the timing that we're doing it and because of the type of project, I don't like to say it, but I'll say it. I'm pretty confident it's going to be some good bids. I just think there's a lot of good, hungry construction companies, sizable ones that can do a lot of good work on this quickly. And it's a very favorable project for them with the road work and the bridge work. And a project of that size is very appealing because it's a lot of good work for a year and a half for those crews. And in the past, we've seen very competitive bids in that time frame, especially for projects this size. With the county prior, we had a very favorable project similar to this, 1,000-foot bridge in the southeast part of the county, mile or two of roadway work, came in significantly less because, again, the size of it was an $8.5 million project roughly. It was just very appealing. And so we had a lot of bidders, a lot of interest, and when you get those type of projects that'll carry a company for a year or so, they tend to do very well. Now, again, now that I've said that, God knows what'll happen. But,
We'll all get to it.
it's the way it is, but I'd like to think that it would be a very appealing project with a lot of bidders.
No detours.
So
No detours, exactly.
a few weeks ago when we reviewed it, we talked about how we had a very careful cost estimate that did put us over our budget, so to speak. However, we also talked about the bid environment is the same as the bid schedule, and we think the bid environment is the same as what we encountered for the first phase of the Cedar River Parkway, and we had 11 bidders on that project, and the bids came in, the top 5 bids were about 15% below the engineer's estimate. So we're cautiously optimistic, but we're also being very careful with our cost estimating at this point. We're still a few months out from going to bid, so we look at identifying projects that fit into kind of 3 different categories. We have the projects we must do, then the ones that we should do, and then projects we could do. So you think of that as high, moderate, low priority. And as we've been discussing a lot of internally, our must-do high-priority projects would be, like Boomer Avenue, it's under construction. We have an agreement and commitment to pay for certain portions of that work. Water main, parking lanes, storm sewer, sidewalks. We have to, that's given. Cedar River Parkway, we're 95% through the design. It's been talked about, it's been planned for. We're kind of committed to doing that as long as it's not, way over budget. That would be just cause for tabling it or not awarding it. 20th Street Northwest, we have railroad crossing improvements that are going to be made with signals and gates. Makes a lot of sense to package and do the roadway improvements at the crossings at the same time. So we're kind of looking at that as a high priority project that we should proceed with. Projects that fit into that should do, but are not necessarily a must do, Cedar Lane. Kind of blanked here. Cedar Lane, maybe 20th Street Northwest, 3rd Street Bridge, or 3rd Street Southeast River Crossing of some form. Those kind of start fitting into those should do if we have available funding resources, then they become considerations. Things that have to do with regulatory compliance, wastewater treatment facility. That's a project that we're going to start talking about here and probably look at getting under engineering contract in March to begin work on our financing application with the Iowa DNR, and then move into preliminary design. Takes about a year and a half to do the design and review process, and then it's a 2-year construction process. So that's going to be ramping up here. So that's kind of maybe a thought process. Must do, should do, could do, high priority, moderate, low priority projects.
It's helpful, thank you.
Were you, Mike, were you suggesting putting the Adams Parkway Bridge in that scheme?
As a high priority, but we have to coordinate with other projects. I drive it daily. I see the progression of the deterioration and how it's starting to accelerate. We would have liked to have done it in 2018, but we actually had planned before the Bremer Avenue project came along. But because of the Bremer Avenue and the way that is being phased and scheduled out, the bridge deck is getting bumped to the spring of 19.
Just a question on that when we're talking funding sources. The wastewater treatment plant, is that going to be funded primarily through the utility rates, or is that going to be, we're going to have to bond additionally above that?
We're looking at state revolving funds to start that off, the SRF funding, because they'll lock in a rate for a long
But
time, but we still have to pay
100%
back.
sewer revenues.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a different source of funding than we're talking about what's.
Not GO
Cedar
bond,
River
it's
Parkway.
SRF, but yet we still have to pay it back with some
But it
source
still
of funding.
counts to our 80%, sure.
No.
Actually, it does not. That's why we'd go the SRF route. It does not hit our capacity.
No,
It's a
that's-
$9 million project.
Just as we're, that's one of the tactical
Absolutely.
things of shuffling where the funds come from and what.
That's what makes it so interesting. For some
Okay.
reason it does, and then this doesn't, but when you look at that.
That's also why we raised the rates to
Exactly.
help setting aside
Accommodate
some of
that.
that money
And
to.
we'll have to look at that adjustment in the next how many years, depending on what the costing is in, because Mike is correct, we'll start looking at getting some design work going the next year or so, because it'll take a year or two to design this. And then in about fiscal 21 roughly, we're looking at construction. And again, I'm glad that we've got this slated in there because, we're trying to get all the useful life we can right out of the towers we have now. And we're probably, I would say, Mike, we're probably at that point, are we not? We're limping these along for a few years, trying to hope that they last by the time this is finished.
Yeah, in 2011, we did a risk analysis on our trickling filters and came up with this schedule, and we're to the point where it's a must-do based on the condition of the facilities, and again, if there is an issue, like I said, it's a year and a half to design and 2 years to build, so we're approaching our comfort level here, or at the end of our comfort, so we need to initiate this project.
Can't just shut it down, wait.
It's a go time on that
Don't
one.
exactly have a detour on it either. Pretty much if it goes, we have a significant problem. So we're getting all that we can out of what we have, which is what you want to do, and hope that this will be online without any issue by the time that is ready to be decommissioned and removed.
So, James, one more time, why is it that some projects do not fall under the 80% limit and some do?
It comes to how you're going to fund it. When you do general obligation bonds, you are obligating the full faith and credit of the city itself. That's the term they like to use. Right. So you're using property tax to pay that back. So that's your ultimate funding source. And they want to limit how much you are going to use property taxes to burden taxpayer, or whatever term you want to throw out there. That's how they want to do it, is limit that amount. And that's what the law has said, is what the code reads. That's why you get into the property tax issue. If you're using rates or fees, such as water, sewer, solid waste, that is not included because it's not property tax. It is user-based, and so they do not consider that part of that agreement. At some point, if you want to talk to Spear about that, they could fill your weeks with why that is the way it is. Good, bad, indifferent, that's how it kind of falls. So anytime we do water bonds, revenue bonds, sewer, solid waste, any SRF funding, state revolving fund, all that has been excluded from that capacity issue. And so even years ago, when we look back at the bonds, we did a GO and retired it with some of the water sewer. Maybe we should have went and done SRF instead, or done something different. Hindsight, you always look at it, was it more of a tax issue or capacity issue? And right now, ours is a capacity with a subset of tax. And that's where you got to figure out, one, can we even do it? Then what does it look like if we do it? And that's where we're kind of leading into this. One, can we do the capacity? And then what does the tax look like afterwards? And the balance of two is a difficulty.
In the past, we've talked about Tiger Grant as a possible funding source, but we've kind of backed
After
away from
three
that.
times
both.
failing and having it not even anywhere in the state of Iowa being awarded one year, and Des Moines got one last year for the money, and honestly, it would delay it yet another year to see if we got the federal funds. And the probability of getting them is so small anymore that we just, and plus it was so late this year, I think, even getting out, we wonder if the staffing's even there to properly run the program.
I think in the past, too, we've talked that getting a federal grant increases the cost because we have to meet their wage requirements, those type of things.
Davis-Bacon kicks in.
Right, and that,
And it costs about, I think about $10,000 every time just to write the grant.
Yes.
So if the chances aren't reasonable to get it, you can start to question whether it's worth
and,
it.
and the thing with SRF funding for wastewater treatment work, it is subject to the Davis-Bacon wages. So one of the reasons we have not used it in the past is because we've been able to bid it, fund it, finance it locally. But this one is so big that it has such a dramatic impact that there's, as James said, there's no way we could do a GO bond, abated by sewer revenues, and for us to do a sewer revenue bond, then you have to have a reserve fund.
Coverage factor, yeah.
So instead of borrowing 9 million, now you're borrowing maybe upwards of 10 million, and the state program on sizable projects is very beneficial. It's 2% interest up to 20 years, and that interest rate can actually be at 1%. It's complicated, but we'll discuss it in the coming months.
Somebody had just told me they saw an article or newscast where Des Moines or Cedar Rapids put in for like an $18 million Tiger grant.
I think it's Bettendorf or Davenport that is doing that, but yeah, the others are trying as well.
There's been many years where not a single one is awarded in the entire state of Iowa. They go to these massive projects, so our $5 million one is not even considered half the time, I think. It's just not seen as that beneficial statewide. Des Moines has been very lucky getting those, and some of the quad cities in those areas, you don't see it in the smaller rural area, because actually they consider Des Moines rural. It's, when it comes to the size of the projects around the country, it's seen as a rural project, even at 18 or 20 million, it's not much to them. So ours does get lost in the shuffle, and we figured for the time it would take and the probability of getting it and the possible delay as well, because you have to wait to see if you get the federal funds, so you can factor in Davis-Bacon when you do the RFP. It just maybe wasn't worth it to spend the money and try again. Fourth time, we didn't think.
I just wanted to make sure I was answering the constituent's question correctly.
Absolutely. So, yeah, again, we get into the WPC, the oxidation ditch project. That's one that we'll look at in the next year or so to get under design, because it will take a while. We want to make sure that we're cognizant of meeting that need, because, yeah, the alternative is not something we want to think about right now. So we want to make sure we have something online before the other gets decommissioned. And so we'll kind of quickly go through some of the other projects that we've talked about briefly, but yet are a few years away or so. As we did mention, the 20th Street, the highway portion, would be the year after the railroad portion if we're able to do that funding that way. 4th Street, I know we've talked about that as well, from Dairy Queen to Burger King. We'll, of course, have to have Bremer Avenue finished by then. We're not sure how that's going to go with the DOT, if they're going to lead that project. We'll be expected to lead it. We're looking at fiscal 20, I believe, before that kicks in.
Well, construction in 20.
Yes.
So design in 1920, probably construction financing 2021.
Might be some state funding for that. We're kind of working through all that. But again, that'll be after Bremer Avenue is finished. And even when the highway construction is done, we still have to get the streetscape figured out and put in. Now, again, that's not substantial amount of money, but it's still, that's the final phase of it for us to look at beautifying that stretch once it's completed. And then, as we talked about Cedar Lane, eventually someday we would go from where the first part stopped and finish it through to Horton Road. That'd be phase 2. But again, that piece is in a lot better shape than the first phase. The timing of that, we'll kind of see how the rest of the funding falls in, but it's just a project, again, that would be something we'd be looking at. And then, of course, South Riverside Park, really excited to see that Monday. A lot of good options, some of them smaller, some of them larger. It really is going to come down to what the appetite of the council is to how much we want to take on. But it's exciting to see that area renovated and have a plan to actually make some good improvement there along that Riverside. And so I think you're going to be impressed with what they're going to present. So we'll factor that in. The final phase of the Public Works building, again, that's been talked about as well, to finally consolidate that entire division out there. We've been setting funding aside for that as well, so we don't have to go into depth the entire portion of that. And we would probably design that in fiscal 20, I think, and we were looking at construction in 21, 22. So again, that's coming. Business 218 improvements. Is it RTA funds, I believe, Mike, that is doing that? The 218 North improvements?
Yes, we have $360,000 in federal aid.
So that'll be coming online in the next couple of years as well, probably right after Bremer Avenue is going to be done. So there's still a lot of activity that's going to be happening in that corridor all around it, but it's planned in, I believe, already for that time frame.
Right, it's an $800,000 estimated project with $360,000 in federal aid. So there is a $440,000 local share.
And it's,
Go from 20th North Airport and out, and hook up to the highway. So that's a nice stretch of road to get done for that, for basically half.
and 218 gets federal funding because it's a federal highway.
No, it
No?
gets funding because it's on, it's a federal aid classified road. So you have arterial, minor arterials, collector streets are eligible. Residential streets are not. It's classified business 218 simply for purposes, because it used to be, US 218.
It's actually not a federal road anymore.
It's
Is that
not
true?
owned by the feds, it's owned by the city, but it's eligible for federal assistance.
Okay.
It's that whole, how come the SRF is not, it's that same kind of, but for the roads. Not sure why they do it the way they do, they just do, and we operate within it. First Street Northwest, that reconstruction, similar time frame, again, about half of that state funding looks like it'll be covering that. 29th Avenue, southwest of 240th Street, that's one that's coming on soon. The county is talking about doing a substantial project and redoing that to the west, all the way to the county line, and they would want us to commit to do the city portion of that as well. And I think that's in a couple of years, fiscal 20, I think they're looking at getting that graded.
The grading would be in the summer of 19, so that would probably impact
Start of
us
fiscal
in
20,
the,
exactly.
in the, right, 1920 budget. And then in the summer of 20 would be the paving. And we have about 550 feet from the end of the pavement by Walmart to the railroad tracks. And then we'd also be responsible for like half of the railroad crossing.
So that'll be a nice new highway heading west, and I think there's a bike trail talked about with that as well. And
Paved shoulders.
it'll be nice. And I think the ultimate goal is to eventually get that to Shell Rock. So in a couple of years, that'll be starting. And one of the bigger ones, of course, and Tab alluded to it earlier, is Memorial Park. The complete renovation of that area, contingent upon if the fair does move from there, which is a contingent upon Champions Ridge and the success they've had, and that'll all come before you in January as well, depending on how their fundraising efforts have gone. That'll be reported, and there'll be some discussion based on what the end result of that report is. And so that's the thing. Once these things start, everything else can go, but it takes the movement of that first item, which again is Champions Ridge and the fair, moving out of there. And then we start looking at Memorial Park and the renovation of the pool potentially. You have the ball diamonds, you have the golf building. All that stuff starts to move once the first one goes. And so January will be a fun time for all of you as we get a lot of this stuff in to discuss. And it's going to be critical to get a lot of movement happening going forward. And that's what's exciting about it. So much of these things are sitting here and waiting. And once you pull that pin, it just starts to go. And that's the hope. So
Are we going to get any, I know Terry Hinrichs was just, did a presentation, but there was really very little in that presentation about progress toward their goal. Are we going to hear any more about that before January?
I haven't heard any plans to have them back before then. I think most likely it'll probably be in early January. We'll know kind of where that ended up at. I certainly have not heard any other indication that that'll be the case, so.
They indicated January. That's what they indicated to me.
6-7 weeks ago, it's probably just the same, that we'll hear in January kind of how the fundraising has gone, and we'll, as a council, you'll decide at that point, did they meet their goal or not, and what to do going forward. So look forward to seeing that presentation from them. One of the final pieces that we'll kind of jump into, I know it's been brought up off and on, actually quite a bit lately, is industrial parks and the expansion of or acquisition of, et cetera. I know economic development, we've talked about it a great deal. I've talked with Bill and Connie about it multiple times as well. There's pros and cons to that in general, but I would say a fair estimate is it may take a few $1 million to get a substantial amount of property from various locations we've looked at to get it developed and ready to be a sizable industrial park, to expand or create a new portion of that. And again, some of the things you look at is, can we recruit businesses in? What kind of businesses do we want to recruit? We know we have workforce issues trying to keep good skilled labor here in the city as well. We have companies that have been here long-term that have some of that struggle. Do you entertain new competition to make that possibly worse? There's just a lot of various different things. At some point, we may have to have a much longer discussion on, do we or do we not factor in that funding to go and acquire more property? A lot of times it has to be an opportunity that comes along, and I know Bill and Connie have been working hard on identifying those and being prepared for that to occur, but I don't know, as a city, when you look at all the other projects we've talked about, because even Memorial Park, we have possibilities of $4 or $5 million it could take to redo everything there. Or, you're looking at the pool in Kate's Kingdom, and just who knows what else could be happening there once we get that figured out. And then you look at the Parkway, and you look at all the money we're talking about, it's tens and 20, 30, $40 million in the next how many years that could potentially be looked at being spent to improve the city and the property and the roads and bridges. So where do you place that in as a priority? That's probably going to be a lot longer discussion than we'll probably have tonight, but it is something that we're probably going to have a discussion on and get into the detail of what we're looking at. I don't know, Bill, as we kind of move forward to that, is there anything you want to add to that as we look? Because it's a tough issue. It really is.
We've been looking a lot. We've been surveying, and we're actually going to identify some people that can help us with that. We're going to work with the Economic Development Commission and bring forward some ideas.
But I know it's talked about a lot. There are issues at times with that.
Again, based on some discussion in the Economic Development Commission, what we call this is maybe part of what we want to talk about. Is it really an industrial park versus a business park?
Absolutely.
Because of what we
Absolutely.
see happening in other communities, a business park may be a better label for it and may help market it to where it doesn't have to be the traditional industrial type setups, those type of things.
I agree completely, and it's my mistake in calling it that. It's what we've always referred to it, but you're right. At some point, do you make that shift? So it maybe isn't as impactful to the existing businesses at hand, and I think it's well worth the discussion. It's just, again, it comes down to priorities.
I think what we've seen fill up the last of our industrial parks have been the People's Insurance and the Ag Vantage and more of the business park type.
And that may be a good way to go. Absolutely. And I know you've identified different areas that are appealing to us to eventually maybe acquire, but it's opportunistic too. It has to be there first. Some of the pricing is a barrier and other issues that may be at hand. And then the other part we look at is then we're also competing 20 miles away with Waverly and Cedar Falls, who already have established and certified industrial parks sitting empty in places, and they're not filling. And it's just a difficult decision because of the funding you're talking about. So do we as a city do it, or do we encourage private partnership to do it for us? How do you factor all that in? But I know it's something that we'll get into another time and discuss. But, so we've gone through a list of a good 15 projects or more that we're looking at in the next how many years? Not that many years away, and we have a half dozen that are really on the horizon right now. To reiterate, you have Bremer Avenue, the 20th Street Railroad, the Adams Parkway Bridge, starting the design for the waste treatment center, Cedar Lane potentially, and then the Parkway. And of all of those, as I look through them, we do have funding worked out for those 6. They do work on paper. It's just a matter of if council wants to prioritize those. And so I suppose at another meeting, we probably need to send out some kind of a discussion point to lock that down, so to speak. But we are going to move forward with some of these, as we already have the engineering in place. We already have them going. And bids will be coming, but we'll probably need to readdress that sometime in the near future as to, is this the right way to go forward? I guess we'll ask the question, is there any of those projects we think we shouldn't be moving forward with, or we should be delaying at any point, or the other ones we talked about, should we be moving them up? I know it's a lot to pull in, but I was curious if any comments, anything we've talked about.
I guess maybe I'll jump in. I certainly support the extension of the Parkway. Certainly timing is going to be an issue, how it fits in, what the true impact to the levy is. But again, the other thing that I'm cautious of is the conversation we had around how we positioned Lost when we did when we set it up for the second round. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about how are we going to deal with residential streets.
Yes.
And my fear is we're putting all of our eggs in one basket, from the Lost money into a bridge in a industrial street that will tie up that lost money for 10 years, and then we're 10 years down the road before we ever start looking at residential street improvements and those type of things. So I'd like to at least get started in trying to evaluate our residential streets in some way. I know 3-4 years ago, some car drove through the community and mapped everything out, but it was going to cost us $30,000, $40,000 to buy the software to look at it and those type of things. But at least getting an inventory and some type of ranking of residential streets, I would think would help us at least understand it. Do we really have as big a problem as everybody thinks it is? And then it may help us identify how we can go about putting together a sidewalk replacement type project for city streets and those type of things.
No, absolutely, and I do recall that conversation. And if we look at local option, traditionally, we've had about 10% has gone to emergency response vehicles, whether it be police, fire, ambulance, that kind of thing. And the bonds are paid off in the fire station, et cetera, I think in fiscal 19. So this budget we're going into will be the final payment of that. So the first payment would be after that's gone. And I would not want to use, by any means, all local option at all. I mean, we want to save a portion of that for that very reason. And that, when we went into this, was kind of the extent of why we would hope TIF would offset the balance. And I think we're looking now at what does that do to the general fund? You have to balance that out. When you pull TIF, we do not utilize all the TIF we possibly could by any means. We use what we need, and that's all that we utilize. And so there is more TIF we could acquire as far as what's being taxed for that we are not pulling in. And I don't think legally we can pull in more than we're needing, especially on the debt side. So I think TIF will be able to cover a portion of that, and we will use as little as we have to as a local option for that very reason, so we can start looking at a residential street replacement program. You know, how do we fund that? Is it for matching? Is it completely from there? And that's just something that's a huge undertaking that it just, yeah, I don't want to do it, but we're going to do it because it's sizable and it's necessary. And we know it's necessary to at least, again, as you said, figure out what is the extent that we're really talking about here. Is it as bad as we think it is? Because there are certain pockets we know have got issues, but is it citywide?
I know you and Mike have gone out with me to look at residents' inquiries on crowns and roads and that type of thing.
Absolutely.
Just like Bremer Avenue, if you're going to tear up the street, if it's an older part of town, should we be doing water service and sewer service upgrades? I mean, it sounds real reasonable, just go out and replace a street, but when you really start to dig into it, it's not just the street that needs to be addressed. And
absolutely. And if you
there has
look
to
at
be a
Bremer
plan.
Avenue, you see the crown, and when that's coming down, look at how much that's been lowered. And that's what we talked about a while ago, is how many layers of asphalt has been put on there, and then it starts to crown, and you see that much more in some of these other streets that have much more severe center to them. Those are the ones that you look at, do you need to take that out? But you're absolutely right. And then you start looking at the sewer, and you look at the water main, and you look at the other services. And so it is not just a street replacement, it is much more involved. And then that starts getting into water and sewer rates, and it starts getting into a whole nother discussion itself. But I do think we have, to an extent, we have some areas identified that we know we probably need to look at, and it's going to be key in trying to figure out how to fund it and what is necessary. So, go ahead, Mike.
Again, my point is, I just don't want us to lose track of that. Seemed to be a priority for the council, and we were trying to get Lost approved and
Absolutely. And again, I'll reiterate that we're not going to use all of that for the Parkway. We're not going to use all the Lost. That is not the goal at all, so.
So I'm going to kind of segue back to talking about departmental budgets and talking about the Public Works Department as a whole and how we attack our maintenance through the community. One of the things that was very helpful and was how we approached our sidewalk repair program. At first, we looked at 4 quadrants. That was a little too much, a little overwhelming, so then we divided the community up into 7 districts. The 7 districts has worked extremely well for being able to manage a sidewalk inspection repair program. We've also been able to package with that going in and replacing, upgrading ped ramps in those districts as well. But we've taken it one step further. So using the 7-district approach, the water department will go into a district and paint all the fire hydrants. So do fire hydrant maintenance, do valve maintenance, do valve replacement if necessary, and work on that. Our sewer line maintenance crew attacks a district each year. The street department goes in ahead of them, and have been raising all the manhole covers flush with the surface of the pavement. Previously, manholes were covered up with seal coating with pavement, and so the line maintenance crew was spending a tremendous amount of time simply exposing them to gain access. So the street department is again by district going in, raising all the manholes. They're now also looking at curb and gutter conditioning and doing spot replacement if need be, addressing intake repair as long as it's up on the gutter section. When our line maintenance crews then go in and do the televising and cleaning, they're also inspecting all the manholes. So now we have, we've added an annual manhole rehab program so that when we're inspecting, we have over 1,200 manholes in the community that are sanitary sewer related. So that's almost 200 per district. So they're going in and evaluating those, ranking them, and those that are deemed in poor condition, we're flagging those for manhole rehab. So that is something that we're now doing. So we stay out either with or ahead of the sidewalk repair program, because the year after the sidewalk program, we go in and do seal coating. Okay, we don't want to seal coat ahead of this work because then it tends to damage the seal coat pavement. So all of our public works divisions are now operating on core services and maintenance based off of the 7 districts. One of the things that we're going to be also incorporating into is we have within our road systems, as you drive around, you'll notice where maybe utility patches were done, could have been done 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and there's been some additional settlement and you may end up with a dip. We're going to start identifying and addressing those to smooth them out. So again, we're going to be doing this a year or two ahead of our seal coat operation, so that when they do seal coat, that we're going to see, I think, again, a better maintained, better riding, better driving residential road system. The thing that we're not able to address without a total reconstruction is the crown in the road. But being able to maintain and extend the life of our existing street system is the goal and objective, because we have probably still in excess of 600 blocks of residential seal coat streets. So even on a 30-year plan, that's 20 per year. It's running about $75,000, $80,000 per block. You need about $1.5 million in funds available to go in and rebuild one, and that's just to get on a 30-year build out. So preserving and extending the life of our road system and our pavements is our first goal and objective, and I think we've got a pretty good handle on that. But long term, yes, you have to do something to address the crowns in the roads.
So that's kind of a lot of what we're going through, and it hits on the more substantial portions of the budget itself. I don't know if council has any questions or any directives they'd like to issue or any statements they'd want to make or anything to help guide us through, but I'd be more than happy to hear them.
As a concerned citizen, my name is Jim Erickson again. I just wanted to make a comment that I feel that Mr. Cherry's, his way of evaluating his projects and everything and employing that three-step process really makes sense. And along with, of course, the council approving those kind of things, and you too, Mr. Broder, it makes me feel real good.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The other comment I wanted to make on this, as we've discussed all this, and you've touched on it kind of tangentially a couple times, mentioned it, is that we do have debt coming off at the same time as we're looking at adding these projects or doing these projects. We do have some debt coming off, so there is going to be, it's not like we're just continually adding more stuff on top of it, because we have a plan or a schedule of things that kind of go through the cycle. That's kind of fitting the jigsaw pieces in.
Absolutely. And like I said, on paper, it's how we can work it. And we always address every year and adjust it when the valuations come in. We always keep a very conservative estimate too. But yeah, we factor in the 10-year bond, how it pays off, and you can see it stair steps down. In fact, with all the projects that we have going on, after 10 years, we're only using 10 or 11% of our capacity, not 80 or 90. That's the goal we always want to show the bonding agencies. We do have a plan. This is not just a ramp it up and keep it there. There are years that will be higher, but eventually the goal is in 10 years, it is all paid off and gone. In fact, my goal in the next few years is that 100% of our debt is paid off in 10 years. And that's what we're working towards. And that's that rapid repayment they like to see. That's what helps to address your bond rating higher, things of that nature. I don't fear debt. I never have, because you have to utilize your money the best capable way you can. There are communities in the list that we showed you that have no debt at all. Some would say their ratings would be lower because they're not fully utilizing what they could be doing. And you're maybe taxing more than you should be, and you're not using your TIF district, because the only way you can access that is through debt. You can't tax with the TIF, but you can put debt service through the TIF. And so there's a lot to it in a sense, and that's why, again, there is a plan as you go forward. You stair step it down every year, 10-year bonds. That's the most I really ever want to go, if we can avoid it. And then it does come off, and in 10 years you look, and it, in theory, is gone. There is no debt. And that's how you want to continue to move forward if possible. So absolutely, on paper, it does work.
I mean, historically, I think the city, with Dick Crane and Phil, we tried to stay within that 10-year, but I think because of the state funding that was available for the dry run and the size of that, we may have stretched a couple of bonds out a little.
Correct. I think it got to 11 or 12 on a couple, and again,
Make it fit, because it was kind of a surprise that we had the state money.
And sometimes we focus on like a certain number, like say the debt levy, we want it to be, it has to be this number. That can only be done by extending bonds or not paying interest, which I know happened for a couple of years. We didn't pay any interest, or actually take it back, we only paid interest. We didn't pay any principal, which then backfilled that in, and it gave us a little complication or two this last couple of years as well. And so it all just comes down to how do you want to manage that piece of the budget? And it is a substantial piece. I know it's talked about a lot. And, we're a growing community, and a lot of what we're doing is to help continue that growth. When you look at the Parkway, when you look at the infrastructure we're maintaining, whether it be 20th Street, because a lot of the building housing is going to happen north of that. You look at Cedar Lane with the amount of traffic on that and the subdivisions it needs. And so a lot of what we're doing is try to help foster that growth for the next 5, 10, 20 years by getting infrastructure in place and improving it so that that can occur, similar to the water main projects on Bremer Avenue. So we're not breaking up the streets 5 years from now because we didn't replace the mains. All that is for a purpose, but it does take money and funding to continue that process. And when you look at a lot of the streets that we have, yes, they do need some attention, but overall, I think they've been well maintained, and it's just a matter of identifying the worst of them to look at, that plan to start to identify. Because we have been out to a few that they're getting a little tough, and we know we're going to have to do something. But again, when you start digging into everything else, it's substantial for 3 blocks. And how do you justify that part of it? And that's where you got to balance that.
I mean, to Tim's point, you should be able to show us how much is paying off each year. So
Absolutely. I can get that to you right
maybe
now if
when
you
we
want.
have the number, we're adding this, but we can kind of see the offset and
Yep, and absolutely. And for budget, I'll show you the chart of the new debt that would come on potentially, the debt we have, how it stair steps off, and we have exactly how much we're paying off in principal, interest. We'll have all that.
I do think some citizens just see us piling more and more and more. They don't take into account what is rolling off the bottom.
We do have to pay it back. So acquiring it sometimes isn't that hard. It's the paying back part that hurts, and that's what we try to do. So anything else from council? Edie, Mike, anything?
No, nothing different than Sir.
Just one comment. The conversation like we've been having tonight reminds me of the complexities that are involved in making good decisions, and they're almost never as simple as people would like to simplistically suggest. And in that regard, I think that Waverly made a really good choice to secure your services, James, and I appreciate your work. I think you're an asset to the city.
Time will tell. This is where we're going to earn it. I think the next 2 years, in all seriousness, are going to be difficult to continue and do these projects within the means we're going to want to. It's going to be a stretch. It's going to be very difficult. And the assistance from the state, I don't think will be there. I think it's going to make it more challenging.
And I didn't mean to denigrate the other staff in the city. They're all great also.
I'll pass all that along accordingly. That's all we had tonight, unless there's any other, like I said, statements, comments, direction that council wants to give. That's what we had for you.
I would move to adjourn.
Second.
Adjourn, all in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.